Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Lee Fisher. I'm the Dean of Cleveland Marshall College of Law at Cleveland State University. And I want to thank you for tuning in to what I know is going to be a very exciting program. We already have over 40 people on the call, and my guess is that by the time the panel actually starts talking, it'll be far more than that. But in the interest of time, we wanted to get started today. Today is the first program of our Racial Justice Community Conversation Series. This is a series of conversations about racial justice that's a result of our recently formed Racial Justice Task Force here at the law school. Our conversations are just beginning, and these conversations are not enough, and we know that. It is just the beginning. We have 3 other work groups you should know about that explore our school climate, our faculty and staff training and education, and public policy action. And I also want to say a special thank you to the Diversity and Inclusion Committee of the Cleveland Metropolitan Bar Association, because they're co-sponsoring our event today. Joe Gross is on the call today. Joe is the president of the Cleveland Metropolitan Bar Association. And I'm also expecting that Becky McMahon, who's the CEO of the Bar Association, will also be joining us. And I want to thank both Joe and Becky. Like our Racial Justice Community Conversations, CMBA, which is the Cleveland Metropolitan Bar Association's Real Talk series, stands for Racial Equity and the Law. And it's their action plan along with ours to create positive and permanent change in the criminal justice system. We've got 4 excellent panelists today to discuss racial discrimination in voting. And I think it's fair to say that there is no issue that is more timely in America right now than this. Our Constitution guarantees the right to vote, with the understanding that in this democracy, elections will be free and fair. But free and fair doesn't come automatically. It requires vigilance. And this is especially true during a pandemic, when some people find voting a challenge, and perhaps even more true in the face of a blizzard of commentary, false news, flurry of litigation, and mass confusion on social media. As recently as the last 24 hours, our president is quoted as saying, "Let's get rid of the ballots." I think he was referring probably to absentee ballots, and I'm sure we'll discuss that today. The bottom line is that Brian Glassman, Allegra Lawrence Hardy, Kayla Griffin, and Sharisa Barrett will be talking to us today, and then we'll all have time for questions. I'm going to ask you to, if you're not one of the panelists, to be on mute. If you have a question and you want to get that and don't want to forget it, you can use the chat function. But once our 4 panelists are done, you can also unmute yourself, just identify yourself and ask the question. So let me tell you a little bit about our 4 panelists. First, Sharisa Barrett is the founder and president of Sharp Education Consulting. She is not only the founder, but she's also a nationally known diversity and inclusion consultant and trainer. Brian Glassman, for those of us in the Cleveland Marshall community, is well known. He was a professor with our law school for 27 years and now has just recently transitioned to a part-time professor and was the organizer and founder of last year's very successful election law conference. We also have today Kayla Griffin, who is the Ohio Campaign State Director of All Voting is Local. We're particularly proud of Kayla because she is a graduate of Cleveland Marshall College of Law. She's also a graduate of the Levin College of Urban Affairs. And last but certainly not least, somebody who's nationally known, and that's Allegra Lawrence Hardy. Allegra is the legal counsel of Fair Fight Action. She's a litigator with the law firm of Lawrence and Bundy, and she formerly served as the chair of Stacey Abrams' campaign for the Georgia governorship. She's a graduate of Yale Law School, and Allegra is here today in also an additional capacity, and that is she serves as the legal counsel of Fair Fight Action, which works to overhaul Georgia's election system to eliminate barriers to disenfranchised voters. We'll begin today with Professor Brian Glassman. Brian, it's all yours.
Thank you, Dean Fisher. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. I'm going to ask Amy Miller to let me know if at any point my audio or video do not work. I'm going to move over very quickly to my PowerPoint. A special thanks today to Allegra Lawrence Hardy for accepting my invitation to present on this critically important topic at this critically important time. And of course, a big hello to all my former students whom I see on the call today. So if you'll just give me a moment, I will share my screen with you. Okay, hope everybody can see my PowerPoint. Let me know if you can't.
Everything's great, Brian.
Okay, thanks, Amy. So I wanted to begin by showing you a roadmap of the topics that Ms. Lawrence Hardy and I will be covering. It is 233 years of American history on the subject of racial discrimination in voting. Roughly, I will cover the first half and she will cover the second half. I wanted to begin by a consideration of the question whether we are entering a perfect storm. It goes without saying that this is a highly contested presidential election, and that control of the United States Senate is also at stake in the November 2020 general election. And now, a US Supreme Court vacancy created by the death of Associate Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg also hangs in the balance. It should be noted that she was a fierce advocate for voting rights, wrote the majority opinion in this very significant 2015 case, and the dissenting opinion in Shelby County, about which Ms. Lawrence Hardy will be speaking. There's great tension about how and whether to address the history of racism in our country, exacerbated by numerous incidents involving police shootings of unarmed Black persons, further exacerbated by what many regard as excessive use of force by police and soldiers against unarmed and peaceful protesters, resulting in great tension about how and whether to address not just policing methods, but the very nature of policing. We're also in the middle of a massive economic downturn, resulting at least in part from a pandemic more deadly than any in the last 100 years. And all of these pressures are now compressed into a very tight time frame, just a little over 5 weeks until the election, at which time the United States Postal Service may or may not be able to timely and accurately sort and deliver an unprecedented number of absentee ballots. This is voting by mail, and it's happening in large numbers, such large numbers due to the COVID-19 crisis. I also have to mention the 2020 census, whose rollout has been highly problematic and whose political and other effects will be felt for the next 10 years. For those of us old enough to remember, the shootings, protests, and presidential of 1968 seem an appropriate comparison. So I want to begin with treatment of the constitutional and framework and history that concerns voting. Our Constitution, so carefully calibrated in so many ways, contained at its heart an immoral bargain or compromise. It was the price for creating a less than perfect union. Southern states had the leverage, and they used that leverage to get what they wanted. The institution of slavery would not violate the Constitution. Enslaved persons were not persons and thus could not vote. But for purposes of political representation, enslaved persons would count as 3/5 of a person. And that is this provision of the Constitution referred to as the 3/5 clause. One result was political overrepresentation of Southern states in the United States House of Representatives. Another was political overrepresentation of Southern states in the Electoral College, since the number of electors per state equals the number of senators plus representatives. That is the section of the Constitution describing presidential electors. Note that the times, places, and manner of holding elections, not just state elections, but federal elections, is at least initially up to the states. That is Article 1, Section 4, Clause 1, referred to as the Elections Clause. That clause explicitly treats voting for United States representatives and senators. Article 2, Section 1, and the 12th Amendment cover the election of electors to vote for a president, also handled by the states. Under this same provision, Congress does have the authority to override state actions by statute, and it has. For example, the Motor Voter Act of 1993. The 15th Amendment is one of the three so-called Civil War or Reconstruction amendments. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment extended, quote, equal treatment of the laws to all persons. And the 15th Amendment, which you see here, ratified in 1870, extended voting rights to male citizens of color. But it was not enough. About 10 years after the end of the Civil War, federal troops withdrew from the South, and immediately Southern states began putting in place a system of laws, commonly referred to as Jim Crow, designed to deprive Blacks of their rights. Generally, Blacks were discouraged or prevented from challenging those laws by intimidation and violence. The same methods were used to prevent Blacks from voting in particular. Less brutal methods were also used in this regard, things such as poll taxes, literacy tests, and the requirements that voters answer impossible to answer questions, such as how many bubbles are there in this bar of soap. The civil rights movement fought over many years and at great cost, ultimately yielded many victories, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the 24th Amendment, ratified in 1964, which did outlaw poll taxes. But the right to vote of persons of color in the South was still not adequately protected. That brings us to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which I will introduce and which Ms. Lawrence Hardy will describe. Getting to the Voting Rights Act of 1965 required, among other things, the Selma to Montgomery March. That, in turn, included what is now known as Bloody Sunday, March 7th, 1965, at the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where peaceful marchers were beaten by state police and troopers. That gentleman in the front who's about to have his skull fractured is John Lewis. That is this John Lewis, who devoted his adult life to advancing the cause of civil rights. It is at this point, oh no, one more slide, I think. The Voting Rights Act was passed. Here you see President Lyndon Johnson signing the VRA into law on August 8th, 1965. And at this point, I will turn things over to Ms. Lawrence Hardy, who will explain how the Voting Rights Act operated and the effect that it had. Ms. Lawrence Hardy?
For those of you who are just joining us, Allegra Lawrence Hardy, who will speak next, is the legal counsel of Fair Fight Action, and we have about 68 people on the call. So Allegra, it's all yours. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Professor Glassman, for covering the first half of these many years. the Voting Rights Act had 4 primary provisions. Section 2 prohibits any voting qualification or prerequisite that would be applied by a state to abridge voting due to race or color. Section 3 required the Attorney General, or allowed the Attorney General to appoint federal examiners to oversee court orders. Section 3 also, of course, has the bail-in provision. This is a provision that we have cited in our current litigation, which I'll talk about later, but it allows states to be covered as long as it is deemed necessary to protect the rights of voters. And Section 4, of course, requires the elimination of previous literacy tests, et cetera, and those automatically have to fall. Section 5 is the part of the Voting Rights Act that you may be most familiar with. That is the portion requiring pre-clearance from the Justice Department before any changes may be made to any laws on electoral systems, representational arrangements, or voter qualifications. So all really landmark, incredibly important protections for the right to vote. And so you see that the Voting Rights Act was very successful in many, many ways. And in June of 2013, the Supreme Court ruled in the Shelby County versus Holder case that the coverage formula in Section 4B of the Voting Rights Act, determining which jurisdictions are covered by Section 5, was unconstitutional because it was based on an old formula. As a practical matter, Section 5 became inoperable without a new coverage formula, which the Supreme Court invited Congress to do in its decision. As you may know, we are still waiting for that. And despite the remaining availability of Section 2's protections, without Section 4's formula driving the preclearance requirements in Section 5, and without the DOJ or private plaintiffs really pushing that, they now have to wait until after the enactment of discriminatory legislation and bring a private lawsuit instead of the step before where the DOJ had the ability to weigh in on discriminatory legislation and policies before they were enacted. Plaintiffs now must bear the time and financial expense of combating discriminatory voting mechanisms. In addition, while plaintiffs wait for the time-consuming legal process to run its course to potentially obtain relief from these discriminatory practices, thousands of voters remain subject to this discriminatory legislation and policies that jeopardize their right to vote. So what's happened since Shelby County versus Holder? These maps will show you. It's been the decimation of Section 4's protections. So since we've seen all of this really go away, what you've seen is a resurgence of restrictive voting laws. And you can tell from the comparative maps we have from the Brennan Center of these places that basically have taken advantage of the lack of coverage by the Voting Rights Act to bring in these much more restrictive laws. Next slide, please. So after Shelby, many states and jurisdictions that were subject to the VRA's preclearance requirements began implementing these suppressive voter tactics. And we have seen all sorts of suppressive tactics, and so I'll just mention a few here now. Gerrymandering, of course, the manipulation of the boundaries of an electoral constituency. Harder to do before than it is post-Shelby County. We've seen, of course, nationwide voter ID laws, which require photo identification. These are often difficult to obtain for those who are living in rural areas. And what we have seen with older citizens, usually citizens of color, who may have been born at home and do not have the documentation required to obtain identification, such as birth certificate. We've, of course, seen the rollout of exact match, a policy requiring a voter's ID to exactly match the name in the voter registration database. This policy disproportionately impacts people of color with names that do not have quote unquote traditional spellings or pronunciations, or names that may be hyphenated like my own. The policy burdens voters due to no fault of their own, except my husband, of course, would say that I made this choice to make things more complicated. But what I would tell you is that exact match is an interesting notion when, usually the word match will do it, right? What's an exact match? And why do people feel so strongly about an exact match? And I can tell you in our litigation, we have come across voters who had trouble voting because of a hyphen in their name, like I have, or because of a space. We have a gentleman in our case whose last name is DEL space RIO. And that space was not there on his driver's license, simply because the DMV does not use spacing when they set up driver's licenses, and he had trouble voting. So we see this, again, really impacting, for the most part, women voters and brown and Black voters throughout the country. And then, of course, we've seen the closing of polling locations, especially in neighborhoods that have young people or large numbers of voters of color. Next slide, please. Here we have a map showing the number of polling places that have been closed in states covered by the VRA preclearance formula since Shelby. So you can see from this data, the neighborhood where polling closures have occurred. And again, I'll allow you to draw your own conclusions about why that has happened there in those particular states post the Protection of the Voting Rights Act. Next slide, please. In addition to state implemented policies and suppressive laws, many jurisdictions have a host of other issues. Sometimes that's inefficiency, sometimes that's intentional inefficiency with regard to actions of elections officials, and those can cause additional burdens and disenfranchisement for voters. Poor voters and voters of color often bear the brunt of the election issues. Some of the election issues that we've seen in litigation and that we include in our own litigation, first, long, extraordinarily long voter lines. You see the cartoon here. One 2019 study demonstrated that voters in predominantly African-American neighborhoods waited 29% longer on average than those in white neighborhoods. They were also about 74% more likely to wait for more than half an hour. And what I can tell you from being out with voters on election day is that there are lots and lots of voters who don't have the ability to wait all day, either because of childcare concerns, because they have to get to work and they don't work in jobs where they can just be gone all day. And so oftentimes a long wait time means someone is being disenfranchised out of their opportunity to vote. Voter purges since 2012, the former Georgia Secretary of State and current governor has purged an estimated 1.5 million people from the state voter rolls. 107,000 of them were removed for not having voted in the 2 previous general elections. That's all. These purges disproportionately affected African-American voters whose voter registrations were removed at a rate that was 1.25 times higher than for white Americans in some counties. So again, these are people who have lost their right to vote simply because they didn't vote. So for example, when we talk to voters who say, I made a choice not to vote because I did not care for any candidate. So they made that affirmative decision. That is their right under the First Amendment, of course. here they are penalized for doing so and have been subject to being purged. There have been extraordinary voter registration issues. For example, and I give you some Georgia examples because I have those numbers at my fingertips, but what I can tell you is we see these trends nationwide. In Georgia in 2018, 53,000 voter registrants, 70% of whom were brown or Black, were placed in pending status by the Secretary of State because of minor misspellings or missing hyphens, the Lawrence Hardys of the world, on their registration forms. There have been examples throughout the country of a lack of equipment, particularly with regard to the technology around voting machines. In our own 2018 gubernatorial election in Georgia, more than 1,800 voting machines sat unused in a warehouse on election day in 3 of Georgia's largest and most heavily Democratic counties. A lack of resources, lack of enough provisional ballots, for example. In some places, there were no cords for the machines, so once the power on the machines went down, they could not be recharged. There have been poorly trained poll workers and election officials not given the resources that they needed. As I said, we've included many of these claims as plaintiffs in the Fair Fight versus Raffensperger lawsuit against the Georgia Secretary of State and the state election board. And what we did was to document these issues through the declarations of voters and poll watchers. What's been interesting here that we can talk about in law school audiences, it's one of those things I try not to talk about at cocktail parties because it's not so interesting for non-lawyers. But here, one of the mechanisms that we used are voter declarations. We had, for various reasons, many voters reached out to us to tell us about the concerns that they had after the election of 2018. And so we began a process that we've gotten much better at over time, but we began a process literally right after the election in 2018 of collecting this information in voter declarations. And now that has become really an essential aspect of our case, is really having that voice of the voter. Obviously, there are many cases where a voter is the plaintiff. Here, our plaintiffs are all voter engagement groups and faith community, and other groups who have really been involved in getting people registered into the polls. But we have the voice of the voter in the declarations, and that has become a really important part of the work. And we'll share with you in the next slide. The fact that many of what we've seen, of course, are what we know both statistically and anecdotally, which is that there's a disparate impact on voters of color for many of these issues. COVID, of course, has only exacerbated this situation. We all are well aware of how COVID has affected brown and Black communities across the country, and how brown and Black voters bear more of that burden of the illness there and of the negative effects. And that combined with the other challenges, long lines. Here you have this long line in Wisconsin. I remember this day, and just, this was a day my family was still sheltering. And I remember back in April looking at these images and thinking about all of these people in April in these crowds so that they could vote because they weren't able to use absentee ballots. And so we know that we've seen that, and we have seen it there have been various studies to look at how many people were infected from showing up to vote that day. What we know is that COVID is having a huge impact on this, and will continue to have an impact into November, and why it's so important that people have the opportunity to vote via absentee ballot if at all possible. Next slide, please. And Maya, is the video going to run there? This is an image I wanted to share with you from the June 9th primary in Georgia. I just want to, again, since it's given the audience, I think it makes sense to share with you that we filed our lawsuit after the 2018 election. And the other side responded by moving to dismiss. And one of the arguments was that these issues were all moot, right? That, you know, they had all been resolved. So you tell me, June 9th, if it looks resolved to you. There is a wonderful video where you can sort of stand at the beginning of the line and go to the end and see how long this line is of people who on June 9th had to stand outside in a pandemic to be there to vote. And what has been incredible, of course, is that people do it. They put the time in and put the energy in and do what they need to do to have their vote counted. Okay, well, let's go on to the next slide. The postage requirement in many states is prohibitive for voters as well. Some voters may not be able to afford postage or may not be able to purchase stamps. Again, they may not be inclined to go to the post office in a time when they are sticking as close to home as possible. Voters are also personally responsible for determining how much postage is needed to mail in ballots, which vary by size and weight. We are constantly being asked whether it's 1 or 2 stamps that are needed. There's a shortage of postage stamps in some post office locations. And indeed, there have been issues with people saying that the post office may deliver without stamps. And so people have a lot of confusion around that as well. There, of course, have been lots of litigation. Many voter advocacy groups have compared the postage requirements to a poll tax violation, which violates, of course, the 24th Amendment to the US Constitution if proven to be true. And that issue is currently being litigated in Georgia, amongst other places. Many states are implementing rules that allow for absentee ballot drop boxes where voters may safely deliver their absentee ballots without the need for postage. However, voters of color may not have equal access to such tools as other voters. In many states, drop boxes are allowed, not mandated, and they may show up in some counties, usually more metro area counties, and not in the same rural counties. I should note that there have been some private donations to purchased drop boxes, and so folks are hopeful that there will be more available on Election Day. Next slide, please. Because of the dangers posed by the COVID-19 pandemic, many voters have turned to voting by mail in primaries across the country, and many more plan to do so for the general election. Because people of color are in a demographic that is more susceptible to the COVID-19 pandemic, vote by mail options are very important for ensuring access to these voters, as well as obviously to older voters as well. And I don't have to tell anyone in this crowd about what has occurred in terms of struggles with the post office. In July 2020, the US Post Office sent letters to 46 states and Washington, DC, warning that delays in postal services may cause absentee ballot applications and absentee ballots to be delayed. thus raising the potential that these ballots would not arrive in time to be counted. And of course, there's been lots of discussion since then about what that will look like. I liked this cartoon because I remember on election day, June 9th, again, this was after we'd been told everything was moot and elections in Georgia had been fixed. And by this time, the New York Times had called it a meltdown, and we knew what we were seeing across the state, that the problems continued. And in the midst of all this and me helping with voters and other issues that were coming up, I had a friend who called and asked me about voting. And I said, oh my gosh, we're hearing these stories. Please bring, your chair, bring a bottle of water, bring hand sanitizer. You're going to be there all day. I said, I can't believe you didn't early vote. And I gave her all of the whole lecture and had her pack all these things. And she called me back about 15 minutes later and said, I'm leaving the polling place. I walked right in. There was no problem whatsoever. And I said, I'm so sorry. I spoke to you like you were one of my brown or black friends, right? Like I was thinking it was like you were like in my neighborhood or one of the people who I've been speaking to all day. But she, of course, lived in a neighborhood where everything was beautifully efficient and it all went so smoothly. And she was the only silly person there with her camping chair and her water bottle. So anyway, this cartoon always reminds me of that because it really does. We've seen both anecdotally as well as in our data, it really is impacted by where you live and what kind of voter you are. Next slide, please. I would be remiss if I ever spoke without reminding folks that there are lots and lots of opportunities for volunteering, and we at Fair Fight are always eager to get folks involved. We have lots of different ways to get people involved. One thing that you might really enjoy is helping with declarations. It's talking to voters and really hearing and understanding their stories. But we also have plenty of work to do in terms of voter education, poll observation, getting involved in other ways. So we hope you will consider it. And we thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Allegra. That was great. We really appreciate it. Some of the best voting rights cartoons I've ever seen. Next, we're going to hear from Kayla Griffin, a graduate of our law school in 2014, who's also the Ohio Campaign State Director of All Voting is Local. Kayla?
Thank you so much for having me. Before we start, I just want us to take a moment to breathe, because that was a lot of information that we just took in. And it can be extremely daunting knowing that we are still up against such a hard-fought battle for the right to vote. I feel like I'm fighting the battles that my grandparents fought, and I am in my early age of just 32. And it should not be like this. So let's take a moment just to kind of center ourselves and catch our breaths while we jump into this next presentation. Okay. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Okay, good. So I'm going to pick up where our last speaker left off, and I'm so grateful to just be joining this panel to discuss the barriers to the ballots and what we are up against. A lot of what our last speaker, Attorney Allegra Lawrence Hardy, has mentioned is right here in our own backyards in Ohio, and we are trying to fight to ensure that everyone has access to the ballot during this time of COVID-19. It is imperative that we remember that we are still in the midst of COVID, and there are still restrictions to how we move throughout Ohio. And we have to be very clear in how we are voting. So we're telling everyone, one, to make a plan. Make your plan, check it twice, and then execute your plan. Here in Ohio, we are All Voting is Local, we have taken up the reins with advocacy, trying to pressure our Secretary of State to expand drop boxes. So that's where I'm going to start here with drop box expansion. Ohio, we have drop boxes in all of our 88 counties, but there is only one per county, and it sits at the county seat. That is typically at the Board of Elections. There has been some creative discussion and talk around how we will administer these elections during COVID, and there has been counties that have looked to expand their drop boxes, Cuyahoga County being one of them, right? And so last week, 2 weeks ago, time is running together for me, but Cuyahoga County said that they would administer teams and send teams out to 6 different libraries in order to collect ballots as drop-off locations. The Secretary of State swiftly moved in probably less than an hour and told them that they were prohibited from doing so because he has a directive out to say that there is only to be 1 drop box per county. The issue with this is that the law is silent on how many drop boxes there can be, and he has arbitrarily put in this restriction. We know this because the state courts have ruled as much, and he is fighting it and now is on appeal. They will take up the appeal on Friday on the state court case. Last night, the federal court case that we have around drop boxes, they were in testimony until 9 o'clock last night, testifying on the expansion of drop boxes. And it has come to a place where they have simply just asked him to remove the directive that would prohibit counties from expanding their drop boxes. He refuses to do as much. So this is one of the battles that we are fighting. We know that if you live in Cleveland and you've been to the Board of Elections, or if you're just leaving work and you drive down East 30th, it is a traffic jam just trying to get on the freeway. And so trying to get into that little parking lot in order to drop off a ballot can be a hassle. It would really administer the flow if we had expansion. And so this is one of the issues that we are dealing with in Ohio. We have put up billboards across the state. We have put one right across from the Secretary of State's office saying that COVID is still here, drop boxes are not. Please expand drop boxes. And if you would like to send a letter to the Secretary of State, you can do so at dropboxesforall.com. That's dropboxes, the number 4 all.com. In addition to the drop box issue, Ohio also has a voter purge issue. In 2019, we saw almost 400,000 people or 300,000 people roughly, who were on the rolls to be purged in what we know as a use it or lose it law. These were people who elected not to utilize their right to vote. And for whatever reason, in Ohio, the Secretary of State sent out cue cards, little post-it cards to folks' addresses saying, hey, are you still registered to vote at this address? Well, what we know is that if you send me a postcard to ask me, am I registered to vote at this address, and I receive the postcard, I might disregard it because clearly you know I'm here. But what the Secretary did not do is really educate folks to let them know that we need you to respond to the postcard so that we know you are still there. And so what happened is over 300,000 voters got removed from the list. What has been less talked about is that another 115,000 folks are in confirmation status right now, and after the election, they will be removed from the list if they do not exercise their right to vote and or update their voter registration. And so we are seeing, the restrictive laws that Shelby statewide or nationwide was implemented. We're seeing that here in Ohio as well. Another issue that we are seeing in Ohio is signature matches and exact match, as was alluded to earlier. There is another lawsuit that the League of Women Voters has against the Secretary of State right now around signature matching. Currently, the Board of Elections can have their administrators look at signatures, and if they deem it not to be an exact match, they can throw out the rolls. This is problematic because folks can be, riding in the car on the way to drop off their ballot and sign in the car, as I do oftentimes, signing documents in the car, or have a baby on their hip and signing documents in the car. And oftentimes when they are calling these folks to ask, what happened, your signature doesn't quite match the one at the BMV, and folks are giving explanations that directly align, they're explaining what is happening. But if you can't reach someone, if someone's phone is not on, if they have subsequently moved, then that also becomes a problem, and you are now potentially throwing out a vote and a voice because of an arbitrary rule, and for someone who is not properly trained in how signature matching should go. The next thing I wanted to discuss, and that that was alluded to earlier, is this notion of how Black and brown voters in particular are the ones who are oftentimes discriminated against. We are constantly getting data from the Secretary of State's website and from FOIA requests to better understand what the numbers look like across the state of Ohio. And what we have learned is that the amount of people who have to utilize provisional ballots in Ohio is constantly increasing. The amount of Black and brown voters is significantly higher than the amount of white voters, and the amount of rejected provisional ballots is at an all-time high as well. And so in Cuyahoga County, we have 33% of rejected ballots. In Franklin County, there is 32% of rejected ballots. In Montgomery County, there's 25%, and in Hamilton County, there are 24% of rejected ballots. And if you were to look at where the rejected ballots are coming from, what precincts they're coming from, and overlap that with a redlining map, it would directly correlate. And so what we know is that Black and brown voters in these neighborhoods are often the ones who have their ballots cast or thrown out because of issues that are directly correlated with, one, their skin color or where their zip code, right? And it begs the question, why is it such an increase of rejected ballots in Black and brown neighborhoods? And what are the Board of Elections doing to combat this, right? We have to do advocacy around voter education to ensure that it's not just the voter rights advocates that are out here talking about educating voters, but it's also our elected officials. So I talked a bit about drop boxes and what we are doing from All Voting is Local perspective. But I really want to center us about what you can do, right? You can advocate, you can educate and communicate, and then you can help us protect the vote. So what does that look like? Advocacy is directly fighting back. We have to ensure that everybody has access to the ballots. And if we are seeing something that is prohibitive, pick up the phone and call. One of the issues that just popped on our radar this morning is the amount of poll workers that, well, we've known about poll workers, and we've been trying to get people to sign up for poll workers, and hopefully everybody on this call has signed up or volunteered in some capacity. But there was an article that was released this morning in Cleveland.com that said our county, Cuyahoga County, sent out emails to potential poll workers to tell them that they no longer needed poll workers. Well, that was inaccurate. They actually need about 1,000 more poll workers. And so my question is, how can this, how can such an oversight happen? And why are we not appropriately staffed up on poll workers as it is? There is a national push right now from an organization that we are working with called Power the Polls in order to filter people in to become poll workers. What is happening to these people who are signing up to become poll workers and not being contacted by the Board of Elections? I personally have had about 6 people in the last week call me and say, hey, I took your suggestion, signed up as a poll worker. I haven't heard anything yet. I had that happen on a previous training 2 days ago from a group of attorneys who they're trying to get their CLE credits, and they're saying, I signed up as a poll worker. I haven't heard anything from the County Board of Elections. It is incumbent on us as organizations to keep pressure on the boards to say, we need to see a transparent process, and we need to make sure that when people are signing up, they are going through the interview process, they are going through the background checks, and they are properly being trained on poll worker issues. We have to ensure that we are registering people to vote. In Ohio, we have until October 5th to register folks to vote. October 5th is the deadline in Ohio. Early voting begins on October 6th. We need everybody to make a plan and execute it as quickly and swiftly as possible. We are not exempt from issues with the U.S. Postal Service. I was out registering people to vote recently, and I found out, and I was just so alarmed, but I found out that over on the city's east side, a lot of the housing projects, while they can receive mail, the Postal Service does not pick up mail from their locations and their apartments. That was something I had never even heard of. I'm like, you don't have a little box to just drop it off? They were explaining, no, we don't have anything in our neighborhoods that, or in our apartment complex for Postal Service to pick up our mail. And we also do not have a post box to drop it off. So we would have to go into the post office in order to drop something off. Postage, we talked about postage a little bit. In Ohio, our legislator blocked the Secretary of State from providing prepaid postage to all registered voters. So that means that essentially you are administering a poll tax on voters who have to go and find postage. And if you know anything about buying a stamp, you can't just buy one stamp, you got to buy a book of stamps, right? And you need more. And we also found out for our ballots, you need more than one stamp. You need to put 2 stamps on there in order for it to match the weight. There has been conversation about whether or not the post office will deliver if there's only 1 stamp, but we are telling people, just to be sure, just to be safe, put 2 stamps on there. These are issues that we are dealing with in Ohio, and we need everybody to help amplify this message, help to squash and squander disinformation and misinformation, and really engage our folks in the voting. So voter registration, voter education, strategic communication, outreach to election officials, legislative advocacy, election protection, and movement building. Aside from, if you are looking for updates, please go to our website, sign up for subscription. We will send out updates of what is going on in Ohio. It's at andstillivote.org. That's andstillivote.org. Again, make a plan, double check it. I cannot say this enough. I cannot stress this enough. Keep an eye out on what's going on in the litigation process here in our state and on the federal level so that we can know how to engage at a moment's notice. We literally are just like moving as quickly as possible. And then know what is permissible in your state. In Ohio, our registration, as I said, I'll say it again, October 5th is the last day to register as a voter. We do not have same-day voter registration, but we do have online voter registration. Please educate your family, your friends, your neighbors. If you go to the Secretary of State's website at voteohio.gov, you can see all of the different voter ID laws that we have in Ohio. There are things that are constantly changing. When I was in school, because I went to a state school, I was able to use my student voter identification, even though it did not have an address. Within the last year, they have changed that. And so we're trying to talk to students to let them know you can no longer use your your student ID because it does not have an address on it, right? So we're seeing that there are laws that are coming through on the books that are pushing young people out of the voting process because they no longer know or things are happening. And the Secretary of State or the Board of Elections are not disseminating that information properly.
Okay, thank you, Kayla. I appreciate it very much. And we're going to go to our final speaker of the day, Sharissa Barrett. Sharissa is the president of Sharp Education Consulting. And then we're going to open up to your questions. We're going to have this conversation go at least until 1:30 today. So Sharissa, go ahead. Sharissa, you're on mute right now.
Okay, I'm done muting. Good afternoon, good afternoon. Thank you for allowing me to speak with you guys today. So, a lot of things is going to be repetitive. And the reason why it's so repetitive, because we just really want to focus on the importance of voting. As you can see this picture, as we know, this is on the same page. My great-great-great-grandfather registered to vote in Washington County, Georgia. We know that was 2 years after the end of the Civil War, 4 years after the Emancipation Proclamations. As soon as Blacks received their freedom, they were excited. A lot of historical colleges, Black colleges and universities started, and they wanted to become elected officials. But we know everyone was not too excited about that idea. During the Reconstruction period, that's when Ku Klux Klan came about. And because the Ku Klux Klan came about during that time, we know that a lot of people were not receptive to Blacks gaining rights. And so, for example, in Wilmington, North Carolina, when they decided that they were not going to allow people to elect their officials. Instead, what they said they were going to do, they were going to appoint their officials. And with that, that meant the people were not able to have a voice, that the government had a voice. But we know that because Blacks were progressing like they were, people were not excited. So we had on November 10th, 1898, politicians, policemen, businessmen, and soldiers all came together to fight, to prevent Blacks from excelling. What they did, the white Southern Democrats, they went ahead, they destroyed property, they destroyed businesses, and they ended up killing a lot of Black elected officials. So as we know, we talk about this, I'm a former teacher, and as a former teacher, I always tell people it's important for you to know your history. James Baldwin once said, "I love America more than any other country in the world, and exactly for this reason, I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually." When he was talking about that, he was talking about that it's important for us as Americans, all Americans, to be able to have a voice. And that's not happening. Last week or the last couple of weeks, Trump has been talking about that we shouldn't have any diversity, equity, inclusion training. And he's also has this new 1776 project. It's important for students to know the whole picture. They need to know why things are the way they are. And that's why it's important for students and people to know the truth about history, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So we already know why people don't vote. You know, many people got frustrated what happened between George Bush and Al Gore. We know that although Al Gore won the popular vote, he didn't win the election. And people got so frustrated that that's the reason why that people didn't vote. So we've already talked about barriers already. We talked about poll taxes, voter ID laws, literacy texts. A lot of times that people who are who don't have college diplomas, they choose not to vote. And so we have to really stress to them the importance of that. Or they just pretty much have a nonchalant attitude about voting. That's why we have to figure out how we can get people, such as people living in poverty or low income people, to understand the importance of voting and how their voices really do count. But we know, because as we know that there's lack of trust in the government. we feel as if they feel as if they don't have a voice on what's going on. So we just got to figure out how we can collectively figure out what can we do to ensure the people what the importance of voting is. So I put this picture because at this point, we don't need any white saviors. And when I say that, when we see the help or blind spot, we need people who are going to be allies, anti-racists, accomplices, people who are going to stand along and try to assist in this voting process. So there are plenty of people, white people, who have been instrumental in this process. Juliet Morgan, she said, "Are people really naive enough to believe that Negroes are happy, grateful to be pushed around and told they are inferior in order to move on back? They may take it for a long time, but not forever." And she was so dedicated to this work. And she just ended up becoming depleted, that she ended up committing suicide because she felt that Blacks were not getting the same rights. She ended up being disowned by her family, and she almost lost her job because of her commitment to anti-racism. So we have other people too: Jonathan Daniels, Michael Swerner, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, Viola Luizo, and James Reed. All these people lost their lives because of the civil rights movement. They were instrumental. And so when we have to figure out, there should be another reason why that you vote. Viola, she ended up dying because Viola ended up dying because she was killed by the Ku Klux Klan because she was a civil rights activist. It's important for us to figure out how can we continue and provide support and remind people the importance of voting. So we do have power. So we know during the Montgomery bus boycott, that company, the Montgomery City Lines, they lost $3,000 a day for 7 months, which is equal between 30,000 and 40,000 bus fares per day. And even locally, people still don't understand the importance that one vote, the power of one vote, can make a difference. Even in the Ward 1 where I grew up, Joe Jones won the city council seat by just 8 points. In other elections too, you can see where Jackson Democrat Nicholas won by 1 point. Where you see in Kentucky, Nicholas Coleman won by 1 point. And lastly, and actually 14 years ago, where you saw where Bryce Edmond won by a coin toss. So if we just continue to focus on that, then people can understand the importance of their vote. So reminding people, because as we know, education is power. And one thing I've noticed is that people don't know, there are some people who don't know the importance of local and state elections. So reminding them, when you see potholes in your street, when you feel like your child's school funding is unfair, or you feel as if that Congress is not advocating on your behalf during the pandemic, or the rent costs or the rent is expensive, or there's not job training for you, or you didn't like the judges or the prosecutors, especially when we think about cases such as Tamir Rice, you have a voice. You have a voice locally and on a state level. So it's important for you to exercise that. Especially, you got to think about it. A lot of times, some people didn't vote during the 2016 election because they said, oh my goodness, I just don't like either candidate. But we have to think about which one is going to advocate for you. Think about, which issues are important to you. Is it healthcare? Is it education? Is it climate change? Is it abortion? Think about, what do you look for in a leader? Do you look for prior political experience? Look at that person's campaign. Look at their flyers, their pamphlets. When they are in debates, Do they answer all the questions? How do other people perceive those candidates? Conduct a candidate report card. See how those people score based on which values or issues that are important to you. Do they answer the questions? Those are things that you need to take in consideration when you're talking about picking candidates that are important to you. So, you know, healthy competition is a good way to persuade people the importance of voting. Peer pressure, we need all the peer pressure in the world. Create an elevator pitch. Could be 30 seconds on trying to stress and persuade people who have not voted before the importance of voting. Emails, voicemails, personal messages to people that you know or your colleagues. We've already stated, report voter protection, call whenever you feel like that people are trying to hinder you from voting. Call those numbers. Contact your elected officials. They work for you. Now, I've been in situations where some elected officials have not been responsive, but just remind them, especially November 3rd is the day to remind them that they actually work for you. Issues that are important to you, such as immigrant families. Pick the candidate that's going to advocate for those individuals. Join coalitions that are committed to this cause. And you have a couple organizations that are on this webinar today. Speak out about policies in your organization. So, like, for example, we know that the issue is people said, I don't have the time because of the hours that I can't register to vote. Then what you should probably think about is like, try to promote policy changes in your organization where people don't have to go to work on November 3rd. And we've already stated the importance of poll workers. So I'm going to end with this. John Lewis is, of course, it's like a full circle moment. To me, it's like we have to figure out how are we going to honor this man who has been a trailblazer, who has been a lifetime civil servant. And one thing and this is one of the things he said in his last letter, when historians pick up their pen to write the history of the 21st century, let them say that it was your generation who laid down the heavy burdens of hate at last, and that peace finally triumphed over violence, aggression, and war. So I say to you, walk with the wind, brothers and sisters, and let the spirit and peace and the power of everlasting love be your guide. And so right now we have to think about this. You know, what side of history do you want to be on? Our democracy will not work effectively if everyone cannot vote. So, you know, think about which direction you want to go. Thank you for your time.
Teresa, thank you very, very much. And I want to thank all four of our speakers today. I'm not going to ask any other questions after that. I'm going to let everybody else do. But I think it's fair to say that there are several ways to look at this issue. One is the long term, and that is what can we do both in terms of legislation and litigation. But with only about 40 days left to Election Day, I want to focus exclusively on the short term. What can everybody on this call today do to ensure that we make sure that everyone possibly can vote and do it in a way that is protected? So let me just outline some of the ways that can be done and ask each of our speakers to address this. Obviously, one is registering to vote, and that's literally almost about 10 days away on October 5th. The next is voting early and the different ways you can vote early, both absentee and in person and drop boxes. The next is voting actually on Election Day. And the next is serving as a poll worker or serving as a poll observer. So my question to each of the speakers is this: if you have only 2 minutes and you have people out there who you want to send a message to in terms of to empower them, to protect them, to make sure that their vote is not suppressed, what is your best advice to them over the next 40 days, not only for themselves, because I think we're speaking to the choir today, to the 70 people on the call, but what can the people on the call tell others to make sure they do, to make sure their vote is actually counted and not suppressed between now and Election Day? And I'll begin with Professor Glassman.
Thank you, Lee. In this time of pandemic, really the most important thing, the thing I would put at the top of this list is voting early. We have talked in the past about get out the vote. These days, I like to say spread out the vote. So we want people to vote early. It will take pressure off the system on November 3rd. That is more likely to produce a complete and accurate count when we get to that count. It is not the way we're used to voting. I would always walk over to my usual polling place and vote in person on November 3rd. Things are different now. And voting by mail, clearly the absolute safest way to vote during this pandemic, but voting early when there are fewer people present at the polling place will make a significant difference. The only other thing I wanted to mention at this juncture is please document your interactions with Board of Elections officials. If you're having a problem, get the name of the person with whom you speak, get his or her phone number, follow up with a confirming email so that there is some sort of paper trail if things go wrong. If you deal with this sooner, you'll have more time to fix it. Thank you.
Vote early and document. That's great. Allegra, let's go to you.
My advice is to put together a voting plan for yourself. And then, because everyone on this Zoom already has a voting plan, to find as many friends and family, young voters, voters who may be running into issues, ask them to put together a plan. What we know from the research is that if people can actually put together their plan and articulate it, they are that much more likely to actually go through with it. And as Professor Glassman says, if it's a plan they can implement sooner rather than later, all the better. They can then track their ballot and see that it reaches resolution, that it has been counted, will make them feel that much more satisfied. My request is that you develop a plan and help your friends and family develop their plans and let them tell you, right? Every young voter you know, don't just say develop a plan, let them tell you their plan, because they're that much more likely to carry it out.
That's great advice, Allegra. That's fantastic. Let's go next to Kayla Griffin.
Yeah, I can only stress, develop your plan, get at least 5 or as many people as you know. But for those who are on the call and want to get engaged, there is election protection opportunities for you to dive into. If you can't do the full day long poll worker, you can be an election protection worker and sign up to work the hotlines. Our hotlines are open currently because early voting has begun. Ohio has 49 designated call lines throughout the state of Ohio. And so we need legal professionals to be staffed on those lines. You will get the accurate and proper training. We work with the Lawyers Committee and Common Cause. They are always pushing out up-to-date information and hot topics around what is going on. Day of election, you're getting updates like minute by minute. And so if you have done all of that, if you've already executed your plan, if you've already early voted and you have some time on your hands, please sign up to be an election protection worker or a poll worker.
Kayla, when you say hotline, are you referring to a hotline on election day itself?
It is actually open now. So it is 866-OUR-VOTE. That is the election protection hotline. Again, that's 866-OUR-VOTE. It is staffed Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. And on the weekends, for those who have weekend early voting, it is staffed for shorter amount of hours, but all of the attorneys, law students, legal professionals, they are working remotely, so you can be at home and fielding calls. And you get this, you can sign up on Common Cause website. If you email me at kayla@allvotingislocal.org, I can send you the direct link, but we are recruiting for hotline workers.
So people can sign up to staff the hotline either by going to the Common Cause website or your website or by emailing you. Any other way?
That or 411 Vote 411 is the Lawyers Committee, and they
League of Women
have
Voters.
League of Women Voters, and they have amazing updates, and there should be a sign up on theirs as well. I'm not sure where it would be located, but I know I can get it to you.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to Sharissa next.
So, like this upcoming Saturday, I'm hosting a voter registration drive. So that's one thing you can do. Secondly, I think, people have to evaluate what's currently going on locally and also on the state level. What do you think? Are you satisfied with the current candidates? Why or why not? And so I think that is the first thing they need to do, is figure out and grade the current, the candidates that are currently in office to determine if they like what they're doing or not. If not, start researching the other candidate and seeing which candidates' issues are more aligned with issues that are important to them. So those are the things that I would say initially to do, because if not, it's going to be, like I said, the local and the state elections are the ones that are more important, especially when they want to have their voice shared on a national level, especially in Congress.
Let's open it up to questions. All you have to do is unmute yourself and give us your name and ask your question. We do have some questions on the chat function, but I'm going to use those as secondary. I think first I'd prefer that people ask their questions so we can actually hear and see you. So please go ahead, unmute yourself. That's easier than me calling on you. Anybody? If not, if I don't hear anybody in the next 30 seconds, okay, go ahead, Denise.
I have a question. Yeah, my name's Denise, and my question has to do with if I've already applied to get a mailed ballot to me. Am I wedded to having to return it that way? Because I've heard chatter in the news about when ballots get counted depending on how they're cast. Thanks.
So in other words, let me ask that question another way too, and that is it better to cast an absentee ballot or to vote in person early or to vote on election day early? And if you do send in your application, are you then committed to vote by mail? Who wants to answer those? Allegra.
I'm happy. So let me say this, just because you apply for an absentee ballot does not mean you have to vote by mail. You may still opt to show up. Now you can't do both, right? So you only get to vote once, but as long as you only vote once, you maintain that flexibility until you have voted. I don't myself, there's a lot of research around which groups prefer demographically which type of voting, right? Be it in person, be it by mail, be it early, etc. I will tell you my own personal preference is I like the drop box. I like not worrying about whether or not I prefer to vote by mail, and I prefer to do it via Dropbox, but I do think you have the flexibility based on what you feel most comfortable with in the pandemic. And look, this is America and all ballots should be counted, right? Where there's not, then it's our job, all of us, every single one of us, right? It's privileged to hold a law degree. It's our job to hold feet to the fire of, for power to fulfill the obligations of the Constitution. So it should be the same to use a Dropbox as it is to vote by mail, as it is to do it in person earlier the day of. Professor Glasson makes a very good point that to do it early takes a lot of pressure off the system, absolutely. And I want to just also make sure I say that the laws really vary state to state in terms of when the absentee ballots are counted, right? So you have some places where they're going to be counted as they come in, some places that can't start counting until the morning of election day, some places have to wait until the polls close. And so that part, those will all matter as well. So to the extent that matters to you, it may be part of your own personal calculation.
So here's a question. Thank you, Allegra. Here's a question for all the panelists, but also anybody else on this call who knows the answer, and that is, what in Ohio is the difference as to when your vote is counted between absentee ballot, drop-in, or in person? is there a difference in terms of when it is counted, that is? Not if it's counted, but when.
And I should also add, if someone else can clarify, my associate was just sharing that different states also differ. In Georgia, you can request a ballot, an absentee ballot, and you don't have to use it. But some states do have differing laws on that, so maybe someone can speak.
Yeah, let me jump in here. In Ohio, our ballots have a barcode. The barcode is associated with the voter. And so if you apply to vote by mail and they have already processed your application, your ballot will have a barcode associated with it. It is advantageous to use that barcode or use that ballot. If you decide that you do not want to, Attorney Allegra Lawrence Hardy was correct that you can still go in, but what you will need to do is take that ballot in, typically early. We would prefer that you do an early vote. Take it in so that they can cancel out that ballot and have you vote at the early voting location. So if you have already applied, they are processing the application. The ballot will be sent to you and it will have a barcode associated with you. If you change your mind and you say, I no longer want to vote by mail or absentee, and I want to go in, you will need to take that ballot with you so that they can cancel out the ballot and you can vote in person. If you do not cancel out that ballot, they will give you a provisional ballot and you will have to vote provisionally. You do not want to have to vote provisionally. Every voter has one opportunity to vote. And so we would suggest that you utilize, like, that's why we say come up with a plan so that you know exactly what you want to do prior, and then you can execute on that. So that's just for clarification. You only get one vote. You can't vote twice. You can't use both ballots. You have to exchange one ballot for the other if you no longer want to do that. I'm sorry, I forgot the second question, so I'll defer to my panel. Oh, it's when does ballots get counted in Ohio? So in Ohio, we are not permitted to start counting ballots until election day, but we do have to go through a process of processing the absentee ballots. So there will be somebody that is opening ballots. You'll have both a Republican and a Democrat there that is checking the ballots. They have to press the ballots and make them flat so that they can go through the pressing process. So there's a whole process before election day that all of the ballots have to go through. And then on election day, as soon as it starts, those that have already been sent in will be the first ones to be counted. And so when we start getting numbers at the close of the polling locations, those numbers that are rolling in that you're seeing, they're typically those folks who were early voting and absentee ballots.
Anybody else want to answer or ask another question? Either way.
Lee, can I just jump in here and put in a very quick pitch for how people can help?
Please.
If I can just go back to my share screen real quickly. Really, that was not supposed to happen that way. We'll just advance through these slides. And I did want to emphasize the active voting is or should be a nonpartisan, non-issue. Everybody who's eligible to vote, who wants to vote, should be able to vote. So we've been talking about this. Please go to Frank LaRosa's webpage to learn about the process, separate part of the page for absentee voting. I promised Jen Miller of the League of Women Voters that I would show this slide about the election assistance work that the LWV is doing. We really need young people to help at the polls, to replace older poll workers, average age about 70 in this time of coronavirus. We are asking young people to step up and do the work on or before November 3rd. So please, many different organizations that you can join and be a part of and assist. So these are just some of them. And I just encourage younger people to consider working, as I say, that day or before. Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions? Let's go Anybody who wants to ask a question, anybody, just identify yourself. I'm sure you must have a question. One question that I do see on the chat function, if I don't hear anybody else, is that this person wants to know whether or not there's a difference in voter suppression of people of low income and people of color. In other words, is there a difference between the ways that voters are being suppressed, whether it's socioeconomic or whether it is by basis of race or ethnic origin?
I'd like to jump in and just say that oftentimes we see intersectionality in both. And as I referenced, when we are looking at folks who are forced to use provisional ballots or have polling location closures and consolidation, if you overlap that with a redlining map, it lays right on top of each other. Our research at All Voting is Local, we literally just did this reporting and we gave our information over to Demos. A report is out in Demos, specifically looking at Cleveland and how the redlining districts directly correlate with Black and brown neighborhoods, impoverished neighborhoods, and those who are systemically disenfranchised. And so oftentimes we try to delineate what discrimination looks like, and everything is so intersectional in this country, and we can't talk about poverty without talking about racism.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? At the end of this, I'm going to give a little bit more information about what is happening at Cleveland State University and Cleveland Marshall College of Law. But before I do so, I want to ask each of our speakers to give a final takeaway for today. And let's start with Professor Glassman. I'll give you your first takeaway is always unmute yourself when you're on a panel.
Would you like me to talk about what keeps me up at night about this election, Lee?
Yes, I would.
Okay. That's one final thought. What keeps me up at night is that not all voters who want to vote will be able to, that not all votes will be counted completely and accurately, and that Americans will lack the patience to wait for a full and accurate count. This last item is so important. I don't think we really touched on it today. We should not expect a conclusive result on the evening of November 3rd, given the volume of absentee ballots that will be cast this year. Thank you.
Allegra, final takeaway.
My final takeaway is just, I have to stay hopeful at all times. And what I would just remind us is, nobody has a monopoly on patriotism, and voting is an essentially patriotic act. We are all privileged, right, on this, in this group in so many extraordinary ways. And with that privilege comes the obligation to uphold the Constitution. So we'll do that ourselves by voting and by making sure that those around us have access, but we'll also make sure that we hold power to account for violations of the Constitution. And we all, every single one of us, regardless of where we come from politically or how we will vote, know that voting itself is a nonpartisan issue, that we can all work hard. It's what democracy is all about. So I'm excited to be part of the journey.
That's great, thank you. Let's go to Sharisha next.
Oh, I think, the biggest thing I remember years ago when I was a teacher, and when Sean Puffy Combs came to Ohio, and my students participated in his Vote or Die campaign. So I really believe and embrace that motto, vote or die. With all the things that are going on, especially people are so confused, I want people not to get distracted by the confusion and devise a plan so they can be able to amplify their voices, especially for those people who have been historically marginalized. They don't think that they don't have any voices. But if we can inform them that this election is extremely critical and just really focus on that and talk about how their voice is important, hopefully we can have a fair election.
Thank you. Kayla.
I'd like to echo my fellow panelists that voting is the passport. It is the key to democracy, and it is just the beginning. There is so much more that we can do. And I think that as legal professionals, we are duty bound to go beyond the ballot to ensure equity and justice for all.
That is wonderful. You panelists have been fantastic. Let me just give you a few takeaways about what's happening at Cleveland State and Cleveland Marshall. First, there are sign-up tables for voter registration in the Rhodes Tower. There's one today at 1:30 p.m. There's another one on September 29th at 1 p.m., another one on October 1st at 1:30, and then October 5th at 1:30. So you can register up till October 5th a number of ways, and one of those is Rhodes Tower. Number two, our Black Law Students Association, BALSA, has a Push to the Polls project where they're actually raffling off. If you take a picture of yourself after you vote, you can enter that online, and you actually can get some prizes for voting early. That's very creative as far as I'm concerned, and I love that. So thank you, BALSA, for doing that. You should also know that Cleveland State has a poll worker excused absence policy. You can get excused from your class to be a poll worker that day, and there's actually a policy for that on the Cleveland State website. And we are strongly encouraging all of our faculty, all of our staff, all of our students, not only to get registered, not only to vote early, but to sign up to be a poll worker or to be a poll observer. It is something that I think all of us should take very seriously as a way to protect and to be guardians of our democracy and justice. You all have been wonderful today. We're going to be having more of these community conversations over the next year on a variety of issues ranging from racial discrimination, employment discrimination, health disparities, policing and police reform. All those issues will be discussed over the coming weeks and months, but we thought that this was by far and away the most important one and the most timely one to begin with. So please join me by giving a standing virtual Zoom ovation to Professor Brian Glassman, Allegra Lawrence Hardy, Kayla Griffin, and Sharissa Barrett. What I would say is unmute yourself so they can hear that applause. They can see it, but why don't you unmute yourself and actually applaud? That way it'll be deafening noise. Or you can use from where I sit, that's deafening, and I saw everybody stand. You guys are fantastic. Remember, vote, vote, vote. First register, then vote, and only do it once, even though I'm saying it many times, only do it once. Vote early and find the different ways to do it, and make sure you do it, and do it as quickly as you can. That's why vote early is important. Brian's right, spreading out that vote is a way to best turn out the vote. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day. Thank you very much.